dystopian fiction has been moved to current affairs.
Hello, and welcome to Dystopian Fiction Has Been Moved to Current Affairs. This is episode 25, Halloween special, and we'll be focusing today on an all-time classic, American Psycho. You are joined by your two hosts, Marcia and Claire, and I'm going to hand over to Claire right now to give us a little overview of the plot.
Thank you very much, Marcia. Okay, right. Well, controversial book and then later film. We'll be talking mostly about the film, although I have ploughed through the book.
Taking one for the team. Thank
That's
you,
right.
Claire.
Yeah. So the book came out in 1991. Is by an American author, Bret Easton Ellis, and it was made into a film in 2000. So a little bit of a gap there, but the actual setting for the story is the late 1980s. And it's essentially a first-person narrative about a yuppie Wall Street type, Patrick Bateman, played by Christian Bale, and his life among the other sort of wealthy circles and Wall Street men whom whom he seeks to emulate and to be part of this world. But we also learn that he is attracted to killing people, particularly women, although not exclusively, generally people who are on the outside, I suppose, of the circles in which he moves, and particularly the kind of impoverished and the underprivileged. Homeless people are his targets, prostitutes, and also a colleague, so it sort of ventures beyond that as well. The significant question within all of this about whether he does in fact commit these murders, because he finds it very hard to get anybody to believe that he has done so at the point at which he tries to kind of confess to everything he's done, leaving us with questions about whether he's in fact a serial killer for whom there is a kind of cover-up going on among the circles in which he moves, or whether he only imagines doing these things and this is in fact part of a hallucination, mental illness situation that's going on. So it's an interesting concept, the whole thing, because it's very hard to kind of genre categorize, and I think that that's one of the things that's interesting about it. We wanted to talk about it because I think that this is in many ways a dystopian film, because it reflects a character as mimetic of his colleagues and his circumstances, embodying something.
Product of the kind of world that he lives in, and in a way, I think the amalgamation of his characters kind of like it's originated in the world that he lives in, which is kind of like 80s Wall Street in a way, dystopian, because of the way that these people kind of like live their lives and the like culture that they have created.
Totally, themselves. And whether that's because it allows the production of a psychopath, or whether it's because it allows the kind of continuation of somebody suffering these kind of level of mental breakdown is kind of unclear. But Bret Easton Ellis, the author, came from this background, so in part it is a very harsh kind of critique of his own character and the impact this world here had on him. But it draws a lot on tropes from horror and slasher movies, particularly.
Yeah, very like psychological kind of horror.
Yeah, but it also, I think it's sort of easy to reduce it to the violent actions when it's actually very much more than that. And the book was for a long time treated as subliterary by many of its kind of critics, that this is kind of, a genre book that rather crudely draws together pornographic literature, horror literature, and even aspects of kind of the action film and things like that. But over time, it was kind of one of those books that people say is highly misread, that essentially it's the almost the quality of reader that is the problem here. A bit like we talked about with Fight Club, how we sort of said that is much kind of misunderstood.
Yeah, well, I feel like, and also the Joker as well. Of ours, please listen in. But Yeah, no, I feel like that is a bit of a string of kind of thought that goes through
Mm.
those specific movies. Well, I feel like, American Psycho, The Joker, and Fight Club are all kind of put into a bit of a like a box together. And I feel
Hmm.
like they have
Yeah,
a sort of it's like an archetype of film. And there's like an archetype of man that kind of watches
yeah,
that
yeah,
movie and completely misinterprets the whole kind of
yes,
messages behind those
yeah,
films and books as
exactly.
well. Yeah.
And I know that Bret Easton Ellis is very keen to uh, categorize himself as a satirist, and that this is satire and it's a commentary on sort of part of society. And I think it's really interesting that when it was made into a film, it was made by a self-branded feminist director. And we can come back to that. But Mary Harron, who adapted it into a film with another woman called Guinevere Turner, and then directed it, was obviously felt that she could justify the argument that this could be understood as a feminist film.
What do you like from well, my questions for you, Claire, having read the book, is do you think the adaptation of the movie the movie adaptation of the
Mm,
book is a good interpretation
mm,
of it? And how do you read the kind of if there is one at all, is there like how do you
mm.
read the feminist narrative within that movie?
Yeah, I think it's a hard one. I think that the book, in this idea of it being kind of a misread text, it had a couple of things that underpin this. I think one was the fact that extracts were leaked from it, hit the press, and they were the some of the most sexually violent scenes from the book. And the fact that this caused all this outcry, including Bret Easton Ellis got lots of death threats. Uh, Now, which is the National Organization of Women in America, called it a how-to manual on the torture and dismemberment of women. And then when people actually sort of started reading it, there was a level of reading that was like, oh no, it's a book about misogyny, but it's not a misogynistic book. But you
Yeah.
have to put in the work as the reader to apply that critique when you're reading the book. Whereas when you're watching the film, what Harron has managed to achieve with her directing is to allow us a sort of second viewpoint. So we're told, kind of with the voiceover and the way in which Patrick Bateman's character kind of self-presents in the film, we're given one line of kind of viewing the things that he does, and kind of the feelings and emotions and so on that both prompt and kind of come from these terrible actions. But we're also given a separate lens, which is that we see with the kind of eye of that female director, we see through the camera towards characters for whom we see either pathos, or we see them as like not fitting what Patrick Bateman thinks that they are. So these women might, for example, be bored when he thinks that they're absolutely sort of stimulated by him, and that sort of thing. We see the fear in the eyes of Christie, the prostitute whom he has picked up and hurt, and then goes to pick up again. We see, I think, with a greater kind of moralistic lens on it, and that in a way is the eyes of women seeing this man and what he does. So in that sense, I suppose you could argue that it's a feminist reading of a book. I think it's harder to justify, as I think Ellis has claimed, that it's a feminist book, simply because from my perspective, even though I knew kind of like how I thought it was meant to be read and so on, in spite of that, it's still really hard to read page after page of detailed sexual violence and other forms of violence. Even if you're supposed to sort of think, God, is this how a man like a Patrick Bateman character sees women? Even if you're thinking that, it's still
Yeah.
hard to be put through it. And that was what I
Yeah.
found really difficult about reading the book.
Why do you think, what is the purpose of being kind of so provocative, especially in
Mm,
the book? And well, and I we were kind of saying before we started
mm,
recording, it's not just the like sexual violence that's like so, you know, graphically, well, got, you know, these sort of graphic details to it, but also there's like whole chapters kind of dedicated to the description of cufflinks and like just the kind of bourgeoisie lifestyle
Mm.
the sort of these like Wall Street yuppies live. But I mean, going back to why do you think the author kind of included these segments? Or, you know, what could you not get across by just saying, oh, these kind of things happened in like maybe a
Yeah.
couple paragraphs,
Yeah.
and then like having to put in, you know, is that kind of because I think there's quite a few books that like to put in these really graphic, kind of horrific details. I've not read American Psycho. It sounds quite horrible, but I do actually have a copy of it myself. But I read the book A Little Life, which also has this kind of there's quite a lot of like traumatic circumstances that happen in this book, and it likes to build on top of those things and like kind of drive, yeah, I don't know, yeah, target these like
Yeah.
characters and these
And I
unfortunate
think that
circumstances.
you can kind of critique this sort of writing as being kind of like trauma porn.
Yeah, trauma porn, yeah.
But actually, what's interesting in a way about American Psycho is that I think it's quite hard to justify the sex scenes and the sexual violence scenes as pornographic because of the fact that they're basically in the same tone as the entire section on, you know, exactly what, you know, product Patrick Bateman uses or what he's wearing, what someone else is wearing, or the long sections that are given over to describing music that he's listened to. The fact that it goes straight from those kinds of things into the sort of sexual elements means that there's not really a switch into something that is lurid or anything like that. It's all of the same. Like this is all part of the lifestyle package.
Yeah. Is it, would you say the kind of those kind of huge monologues in the movies, right? For example, right at the beginning where he is describing like his whole kind of morning routine, the products that he uses on his face, is quite a monotonous, monotone kind of narrative. Is that also carried through into the book?
Very much so, and that I think is, you know, the film can't render it to anything like the same extent, but it does do things like that's a very good example of a scene where we see the kind of all the brand names and all the ways in which these the sort of way in which I suppose Bateman is sold things as a consumer that he thinks will turn him into a certain kind of person.
Yes.
And I think it's, you know, going back to kind of like why write this kind of book, why write it in this way? It's interesting that Bret Easton Ellis, the novelist, he did an interview for the Paris Review in 2012, which sort of links his experience of this kind of world to the book that he wrote. And he says that it came out of a place of severe alienation and loneliness and self-loathing. And he sort of says he was pursuing this life that he calls the kind of the GQ way of living. He knew it was bullshit, but he kind of couldn't help doing it. Like he was being sold this product, like you've got to become this kind of man. And he too, in that interview, compares it to like Fight Club, men being sold some sort of ideal of which they, you know, must necessarily always kind of fall short.
I mean, it's funny because throughout the movie, Patrick Bateman does, among his peers, fall short, despite like, and it's almost comedic to the extent that he, the friends that I decided to watch this movie with my flatmate. As
You
like
subject
a little
them to the
evening.
best. So
Yeah. To be fair, one of them was like, "Oh yeah, I bloody love that movie." This is one of my good friends, Beth, who I live with. She was like, I actually I think it's kind of a bit of like. I mean, the whole entire, well, I guess you can argue that satires are comedies in some sense, but she was like, I actually thought it was really funny. Just like it's exactly those kind of long monologues about him and about what Patrick Bateman and his some morning routines and even the section with the business cards. It's really funny. Like it's actually you watch it and you think this is ridiculous. This is actually like the extent and him feeling like they all pull out the exact same looking kind of business cards and the gag is he sees what everyone else has, and it's just like slightly different shades of white, but
Yeah,
like
exactly.
exact
Slightly
same font.
different lettering. Yeah,
Yeah, and he's
exactly.
just distraught.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
camera cuts to him, and he's
Mm.
literally just like,
He's
just
and that you can see that rage kind of bubbling up
yeah,
within him that he's vulnerable. And it is interesting, and I think again in this sense of what is or who is the real Patrick Bateman, that one of the sort of features of the film is firstly that all the male characters, with the odd exception for the coded queer one and things like that, they
yeah.
basically all look exactly the same. So
Yes.
they've all got
Well,
the same.
oh yes, and this is the thing is they will confuse each other for
Yeah,
one
exactly,
another,
all the time.
and
Yeah,
that's oh my
yeah.
God,
Which,
that's so true.
yeah. So
Yeah.
there's this thing really about, almost to the extent of, does Patrick Bateman actually exist at all, or
Yeah.
is he the person that he appears to be, like on the screen but or through his own eyes? Because when we get him talked about, like even up to the bit where he's like, no, I've killed all these people, like it's like, no, Patrick Bateman wouldn't do something like that.
Would
He's so dull. He's such a loser. And even though we can't see any difference between him and like all the other people who look like him and
yeah.
behave like him, um, they obviously give us that little fraction of a sort of moment of firstly like always thinking he's somebody else, so he's not memorable in any way.
And then it's like,
Um,
but then there's layers to it because who they think he is he actually someone else also? It's all like,
yeah,
oh, but yeah, no,
exactly.
that's so, does
Mm,
he even exist? Well, this is, I mean, we'll get onto the like
mm,
whole entire kind of overarching plot, but it's also
mm.
ambiguous anyway.
Yeah,
Um,
it
so it's
is.
just there's a lot of more different ways you can interpret it. But yes,
Yeah.
indeed.
So I think before we kind of like go into some of the themes a little bit further, that it's worth thinking just a little bit about the title, because I found that really interesting as I was
Yes.
kind of reading up on this about like the way in which it may like prompted me to think of different things, because it's like Patrick Bateman is this definitive American. We said that he's like the product of Wall Street. He's
Yes.
a wealthy white man. In the film,
Living.
it's
I love the
implied that
American
his
dream.
in the film it's implied that his father owns the company, or I'm not sure it says that in the book, but he's of a type,
Yeah.
and he's of course we're in the era of Reagan in America and Thatcher in Britain, but this move towards a sort of uh, new view of capitalism and worth in kind of economic worth and libertarianism and particularly kind of like new attitudes to market economics and so on, all of which fits with this idea that these people consider themselves so superior. And this plays
Yes.
out in the way that Patrick kind of chooses his victims and so on. So it kind of the American dream is in there as well, that there's something like aspirational, but also there's like a dark side to that, where remember when he kills Al, the homeless guy,
Yes. Yeah.
and he's basically like, why don't you get a job, Al, and so on. And it's really kind of this sense that this is your fault. You've lost your job and you're drunk in an alley, and this is clearly something that you don't deserve to live because you smell so bad and you haven't made this effort. So it feels like it's
Yeah.
very much in that kind of American world, and that made me
Yeah.
think like as a kind of like modern reference, it makes me think of like the MAGA movement and things like that.
Yeah.
Especially because Trump, so we all know Trump, as in the businessman Trump of the 1980s, appears, I think his name comes up 400 times in the book. And
What, really? Oh my gosh.
Patrick Bateman is constantly like, I mean, it comes up a
That's
bit. It comes up a
crazy.
bit in the film, but
Yeah.
he's
Yeah, I
like
think,
always
yeah.
wants to do like what Trump would do and change his opinions to what Trump's opinions are. And he wants, I think it's like first or second on his list of like aims for the year is to get invited to the Trump Christmas party and so on. So, that feels just like a whole other side of that at the moment,
Yeah.
where it still seems that Trump kind of fulfills this aspirational American business icon for some people in the States.
Yeah.
And then obviously like paired with the word psycho, which it's an allusion to Alfred Hitchcock, and so the kind of the background to the beginning of the kind of horror genre moving into the kind of slasher genre in Psycho, lack of empathy in Psychopathy, but also the idea that this is kind of like potentially a mental illness and so on that is affecting him and that with which he can get no help. So I thought once you sort of dig down into it, there's a lot in that.
Yeah.
But what I think is important, though, to come back to something you said, is that this is American Psycho could imply a kind of generic gathering in of kind of anybody's potentiality to aspire to or to become this kind of person, a Patrick Bateman. But this strikes me as a time when it's really important for us to think that no, I don't think anybody can. Even now, I think that this is something about men specifically. And I wondered whether you thought that it was like kind of something that was left behind in the 80s, or whether we think that it is something that is perpetuating now.
So what, this kind of aspiration to become
To become a
like
certain type,
characters,
yes,
such
or
as,
and
well,
particularly
not to
like,
the same extent, but
but like to
like in the
become like packaged as a masculine ideal
as masculine
in this
ideal,
way.
yeah.
Maybe it's a little bit different because times have changed, but how different is it really? Sort of the way in which pressure is put on men to conform to some masculine ideal, the way that Bateman seems to.
It's interesting to me because Bateman obviously is this kind of like, he's put up on, well, you could argue he's put up on this masculine pedestal, but at the same time, he has like a skincare routine, which I wouldn't say in some like, and the like his extent of cleanliness and this like he has his home is very sterile, just like in terms of the way that it's decorated, it's almost completely white. Everything is clean at all times, and he is kind of obsessed with the, in terms of the suits that he wears, like these like high-end designers and his business card. And I feel like there's almost, an element of kind of, I don't know, like that in some ways that's also feminine. And it's kind of how we were arguing when we were sort of speaking about Fight Club in one of our previous episodes, saying how there's almost that like homoeroticism kind of vibe to the masculinity in this case. I think, I don't know. I definitely think that is something, at least to the people that I'm exposed to, no one actually kind of goes around being like, oh, I want to be like this man. But I mean, it's interesting because I think, especially with Halloween right around the corner, a lot of people like to go and dress up as Patrick Bateman. And I think he has this weird, and I was discussing this with my flatmates, this kind of weird like sex appeal in the I don't know, in the behaviors, and even like, and I think this is something to discuss about serial killers, because with the mention of Ted Bundy, I feel like I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here.
That's all right.
But we'll get there in a bit. But I don't know. I think it is something that's been left behind, because I think there's much more conversation about, especially with movements like in thoughts around like gender and what is appropriate and what can be considered masculine and feminine. People are moving on from these kind of things.
So maybe what I would say is that there is also simultaneously something reactionary against that. And we get a lot of this stuff about, with the rise in incel culture, the popularity of people like Andrew Tate, for example. Isn't there also something that is basically saying, no, we need to kind of reclaim masculinity in the face of this?
True, yeah.
I mean, also, well, like I was thinking about the sort of 80s aesthetic of the whole thing, bearing in mind it was filmed in 2000. So it's all a conscious decision to make sure that it's still very much played within its late 80s construct. And the fact that you can often see memes, right, where people are like, okay, so when you look at the 80s, this is like a gay person and this is a straight person, and they're both like wearing like completely ridiculous bright color, like crazy sort of makeup and all of this sort of thing, because it was the fashion of the time. Now Patrick Bateman and his friends are partying with those kinds of people. They're at the clubs and things like that. But obviously their look is very much kind of the Armani suits.
That's so true, actually. Yeah.
So I wondered whether it was actually like a sort of, it did fit with this idea, I suppose, of in a modern sense, this claim that men, young men, believing that they no longer understand what their place is in society because wokedom has taken over, and now women are, actually able to exactly. So like,
rights, what?
So all of that, and it just made me think, well, actually, maybe are we going back to something like this? The idea that Patrick Bateman would be in any way kind of an attractive character, I find him like genuinely really frightening, and I don't find him frightening just when he's doing extreme acts. I find him frightening when, do you remember there's a scene quite early on where he's walking behind and then next to a woman on the street?
Yes.
That is why he is scary. The fact that he, won't stands too close and speaks to her in the dark and so on. These are the things
Yeah, that's very true.
you know, that we still see. So yeah,
Yeah.
but I
I
do
mean,
think that this is something about like masculinity overall, and I think that, you know, his drive to kill women, he doesn't just kill women, but
no,
women, and the connection that he makes between sex and
and violence.
violence is,
Yeah.
although interestingly in the book, rather like in the film, you know, when he has sex with the two prostitutes, Christy and the one
Hmm.
that he gets on the phone,
Yes.
and they have, you know, sort of normal non-violent sex in this threesome, and then that all seems to be consensual. I mean, you know, he's deliberately asked for, you know, people to, a woman who will do couples and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
So yeah, consensual in the loosest sense. And then he sort of says, no, wake up, we're not over yet. And we just see the drawer opening, and then we see him sort of sending
Yeah,
them
kind
out
of
on their
going out.
way,
Yeah.
having
And
been
it's all kind of
violently
bloodied. No,
attacked.
yeah.
And it's the same in the book, that actually, again, when we're talking about the pornographic elements, yes, there are times when we get incredibly gruesome description, but that's not one of them. We get highly descriptive accounts of the first sort of lot of sex, and we don't get it of the second lot. The violent stuff is actually kind of kept from us and
Okay.
left to the imagination. But nonetheless, as you say, there is definitely something here about sort of sex and violence going together. What interests me in the film was the way in which that sex, as well as not seeing that particular act of violence, the sex that we see is much more like focused on Christian Bale than it is on the women.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and
Well,
again,
this.
you're
Yeah.
thinking
That whole
about things that
entire.
are funny, that
Yeah.
bit
That
where
was
he's
quite.
in the
Like
mirror.
looking at himself in the mirror, like, and the camera doesn't even, it's literally like the women are out of frame
Yeah.
principally. It is literally just him like kind of looking at himself in the mirror.
Yeah.
I'm like pretending to act out looking at myself in the
Yeah,
mirror, but I realize
exactly.
we're recording a podcast, so no one else is
It's
seeing this
true.
first.
No, but very nicely done. Yeah, I mean, but it is, and it is hilarious, like the narcissism of it,
Yes.
and the fact that this is what I mean, I suppose, by saying that we get this woman's kind of perspective where
Yeah.
we are not like, the gaze is not the male gaze. It's not exactly a female gaze, but it's a gaze that like reflects
It's
Patrick's gaze.
Patrick
Yeah,
Bateman. Yeah, I guess.
yeah.
I mean, this. I think. Well, that's kind of like the narcissism is exactly what's kind of like central to the movie, and I guess the kind of aspect of the psycho, kind of the psycho of the American Psycho.
Yeah,
But I mean, also the American of the American Psycho, because it's like
yeah,
the whole
absolutely.
individualism
Yeah,
aspect, like libertarianism.
yeah.
But like one of the things I was kind of thinking about a lot with this movie. It mentions like Ted Bundy in it. I think I can't remember what the fun fact was in the movie
Yes,
about
yeah.
Ted
Which
Bundy, but
is
he
it
is
about Ted
mentioned.
Bundy's dog? Is that,
Yes, I think it is
yeah?
about Ted
And people don't
Bundy's
know who
dog,
Ted
and
Bundy is.
it's like he's Ted Bundy, and it's like it's funny, but he's like I think you know, there's especially with the sort of flare up in the last couple of years, like the whole like true crime kind
Yeah.
of documentaries, and I think there's a bit of also an archetypal woman who's kind of specifically into that. But it's interesting the kind of like speaking about the sex appeal that people do find in Patrick Bateman's character dressing up as him, and you know, sort of saying, "Oh, this is like some kind of like masculine, I don't know, guys or whatever," and also like it kind of lines up with the whole experience people had with Ted Bundy is like during when he got caught as a serial killer, and even during the trials that he had, there'd be like huge crowds of women
Yeah.
outside of the courtroom, kind of like basically like fangirling over him, and it's it's a very interesting phenomenon to sort of see. And I don't know, do you know, like is like I don't know, it's interesting to interpret why that happens. Like maybe there's kind of a bit of obviously I think there's a bit of like the interest in the unknown and the whole entire like I can fix him probably mentality
Yes, I
among
think that we
people.
definitely hear about that, don't we? And I think that there's also, when you read about psychopathy, many completely functional psychopaths get by because they adopt this charming persona that means that
Yes.
it's very hard for people to sort of see that this is all
See
a
beyond.
mask and so on.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
that
for
that's
sure.
something that we see in the Patrick Bateman portrayal. I think that there's something really
Yes.
interesting about this whole sort of thing about his masculinity and his identity generally, is that
Yes.
he is always trying to kind of create himself, self-create. And actually, it made me think, something I hadn't thought of before, was that like when he talks about Ted Bundy, that's one of the few times when he seems to be like actually expressing something about one of his own personal interests that he's created an opinion on, because almost all his other opinions are like so obviously kind of like lifted
From like reviews and other,
exactly,
especially the way he talks about music and
yeah. I
goes
thought
on
of
these
you as somebody
long
who like
tangents.
writes about music. It's just like so so taken out of whatever he's read, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
And also with restaurants, which is another kind of aspect of kind of consumerism that comes up a lot, this idea of, which restaurants are in which guide and what different reviews have said about them, and you must eat this because this magazine says whatever.
Yeah.
And the time when that becomes funniest, in my opinion, is probably when he starts recycling kind of media speak about politics. Do you
Yes,
remember that?
I was going to say this. As I think it's the scene maybe just before he kills that first homeless man,
Yeah, that's right.
and him going on. I know, it was such a good. For those who don't know,
Yeah.
a bit of a Letterboxd junkie, but I love going through the like reviews on Letterboxd for each movie that I watch. But someone was like, Patrick Bateman may kill lots of women and homeless men and prostitutes, but what he doesn't do is let his friends get away with anti-Semitic comments.
That's true. Yes, yeah.
Which is just so, and I think again, it's one of the first kind of scenes that we see him in.
Yeah, it's true.
Which is interesting to see how they introduce him as that character. But again, it's part of that. I think it's exactly indicative of how people who are kind of psychopaths and have this like lack of empathy do kind of they just recycle. They are kind of masked in the fabric of society or whatever. Is that they just kind of do repeat these things that like make them feel empathetic.
That's right. Yeah.
Like
I
you
mean,
don't if you go in blind, you don't know what this movie is about. You're kind of like, oh, this guy seems in the first couple
yeah,
of
I think
minutes
so. I
pretty
mean, and
pretty legit.
if you don't really listen to the actual content of what some of these things are, because they do become kind of like so sort of blasé. But
It is very
I've got a
blasé,
bit
yes.
of the quotation here of the sort of soundbite bit where he says, "We have to end apartheid and slow down the nuclear arms race, stop terrorism and world hunger, prevent the spread of communism in Central America, work for a Middle East peace settlement, prevent US military involvement overseas. At the same time, we need to promote economic growth and business expansion and hold the line against federal income taxes." And it's just like it's like all the sort of like hot topics of the moment, and
Yes.
so I think that there is this idea of like he is a consumer of everything, and
Of
then he
everything,
just kind
yeah.
of like reenacts it in the way that he talks about all of these things. But yeah, in the book we'd see this, there's a whole chapter on Huey Lewis, there's a whole chapter on Whitney Houston, there's a whole chapter on Genesis, and we see all of those kind of rendered in dialogue forms in the background of different things that he's saying. But it certainly makes him like into this character that really well embodies this idea that all of these men are essentially like this or have the potential to be like this, because they're all so much the same, and his ideas could be the ideas of any of the people who are present. What did you think about the homophobia aspects of his character?
Yes. So it comes up once with Lewis in the Lose, which again is almost it's quite a comedic scene in a sense. It's kind of argument for the whole comedic satire, but he's about to strangle Lewis, who he seems to have a very deep hatred for before it's kind of revealed to us that I don't know why I didn't see it coming actually. It was poor from me. My gaydar's been a bit off, but it was just no, Lewis turns around and he thinks it's Patrick coming on to him.
Yeah.
Which is just very clever and very funny. But
Yeah.
and Patrick is just completely disgusted. I don't know. It's the thing is like it's obviously homophobic, but he doesn't outright say anything. I don't like other than that specific scene. You're gonna have to remind me whether it comes up again because
Yeah. I
obviously
mean,
really disgusted the way that he kind of like becomes pale and sweaty and washes
yeah,
his hands, which already have
your
gloves on
gloves on,
them.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, with also with the 80s in New York, kind of like,
Mm.
you know, AIDS and stuff.
Yes, I mean, obviously we are at the
Like,
height of kind of homophobia because of the fear of
yes, because
AIDS
of
and so
that,
on.
like fear of
Yeah.
AIDS.
But yeah, there is
Yeah,
something, I think, again, it sort of fits with the majority of the men with whom he's mixing, though, because I think we get quite a bit of homophobic language being thrown around
oh,
by
really? Yeah.
them. But it's probably not as prominent as I seem to remember it being in the book.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, again, I think it fits with this idea perhaps of what it means to be a man is
Yeah.
sort of aggressively heterosexual in this world, which for him is not about, treating his relationships with any concern, because of course he is supposed to be marrying Evelyn,
Yes,
being played
this,
by
yeah,
Reese
oh,
Witherspoon. Um,
yeah.
and again, she doesn't even seem to see him for
Who
like
he
who
is,
he
and
is or
which is
anything.
complete. Again, I don't know how it is in the book, if there's like more kind of missing context, but throughout the film, she kind of just seems like this side character. Like they're meant to be getting married. Like
Mm.
someone in the partnership, probably Patrick, has proposed,
Mm.
and they're meant to be getting married. And yeah, he is completely blasé about the fact that they're both having affairs.
Mm.
Again, why would it matter to him? Like it's the whole American Psycho thing, but yeah, they barely seem to know anything about each other or anything. Again, and that's kind of leaning into that like fake American dream of like having the wife at
Well,
home.
yeah, I think there is that, and
Yeah,
there's sort of the ideal family element to that. And
yeah,
in a way, she too, as being kind of a suitable person for him to marry, fits into this idea of kind of him as consumer, like she's something to be bought,
thoughts, yeah,
attained in that sense. And she plays that out as well in the way in which she talks about things like their wedding, and it's all about kind of like the wedding, not about the marriage or anything.
yeah,
So, and among the people that obviously he is also sleeping with, we see, various prostitutes, but we also see his colleague's fiance, who is it is it Elizabeth? Is that the one? She's the one who's always out of her mind on lithium, and again,
yes,
you know, simultaneously horrific, this idea that he takes her out to dinner and sort of takes advantage of the fact that she's just like falling asleep on the table, and he keeps kind of
yes,
like
yeah,
propping her
trying to
back up
back
again.
up, yeah,
So yeah, so that kind of a level of misogyny as well, I think, is at play. One of the things that it also made me think of in terms of like the way in which he's constructing his identity is around the place of his work within that as well, because this obviously, business cards aside, plays quite a big part in what he does, but we never see him do any work. So I just
yes. No, actually, so there was a bit. I remember watching an interview, which
Mhm.
I'll try and find later and link under the episode, but
Thank you.
where I think one of the maybe writers for the film or
Mhm.
something, I'll double check again who it was, but was talking about how for the research of American Psycho, he went around and followed some just Wall Street
Mhm.
people for like a couple days, and all of it was getting invited to dinners and various fancy parties and stuff. But the thing is, he never got invited to the office. Like he never got shown anything that what happened
Mhm.
actually went on in there. Any whether these people actually did any work. It was
Mhm.
all kind of just felt like their lifestyle was
Mhm.
going out, drinking, eating,
Yeah, and I
spending
think
money really.
we still get a certain amount of this probably in the city. The idea that actually, deals are made over dinners and lunches and
Yes.
copious amounts of booze, and somebody else sort of follows it up back in the office.
Yeah, in the office.
Um,
Yeah. But
but
even when he is in the office, he's
I know,
literally doing like
yeah,
flipping through
that's it.
pornography, doing some
Yeah.
crosswords. Like every single time his assistant comes in, he's like making excuses, being like, "Tell them I'm at lunch," and she
Mm.
goes, "But Patrick's, it's only 10:30."
Yeah.
I think they know
No,
you're
it's like 10.
here.
Yeah. I
Which
mean,
is
the
like
depiction
again,
of
very
Jean,
funny.
the secretary, as a son, a sort of stereotype in its way. The sort of,
Yes,
she
yeah,
seems slightly besotted with her boss and so on. But again, she's
yeah.
another woman who gets manipulated by him.
Yes, so
Mm.
I actually wanted to kind of bring this up because it's the one occasion where he invites, classic kind of setup. He invites her around. He like brings, I don't know, a knife behind his back to her,
Mm.
and then It's one of the
Oh,
one
it's worse
occasions
than
when
that.
we see him.
It's the nail gun, isn't it? That he's
Oh my
holding.
God. Oh
I
yeah, it's the
think on
nail
that one.
gun.
Yeah,
Oh
that's
God,
really.
that's actually really horrific. But
Yeah.
yeah, so he gets around behind her,
Mm.
holding the nail gun, and then he decides not to do it.
Mm.
And maybe well, like, what's your interpretation behind that? Because that's not where the killing stops. Like he obviously continues after that,
No,
but
no.
it's just one occasion where he decides you should probably leave because something bad is going to happen.
Yeah, and I think it's partly the talking at cross purposes thing, which is obviously again a
Yeah,
level of humor where it's like, I
yeah.
think if you stay, you'll get hurt. And she's like, oh yes, well, I know that you're engaged to somebody else. And he's like, no, holding a nail gun. Yeah, exactly. I think that it's partly because I think that she actually sort of sees him a little bit more than anyone else. I mean, it is her at the end who, in the film, because we get this third person element that we don't get in the book, we see her in the office looking through his
His
grotesque
notebook,
drawings of
yes.
exactly. Again, a reminder of what he's like actually be doing in the office. So something encourages her to do that. You know, she's starting to be suspicious. So I think there is something about her feeling, you know, maybe that, you know, she sees something in his kind of loneliness and his inability to sort of, you know, form normal relationships and so on, that plays out. Maybe there is some sort of sense of not wanting to hurt somebody who is close to him, because really mostly the people he kills are separate from his life, with the exception of Paul Allen that we can come back to in a moment. So yeah, so I don't know exactly, but yeah, there is clearly something with Jean that is that little bit different. But she is frustrating because she is kind of this sap who allows him to sort of say things like, "Don't wear that outfit again,"
Yeah.
and so on, and it's flirts with her whilst making her book dinner for him and other women and so on. But the closest person that he does kill, and the one that has most relevance to work, is Paul Allen.
It's Paul Allen, yeah. Oh, and Willem Dafoe. Bloody, it's such a nice surprise seeing Willem Dafoe. Bloody love Willem
Yeah,
Dafoe.
absolutely. So yeah, so okay, so Paul Allen's the sort of the turning point where he kills somebody who people actually notice is missing. So that's sort of a problem. And the question really is, why does he do this? Why does he kill Paul Allen? And is it just because Paul Allen holds the Fisher account, the one that that he wants to have, even though he doesn't do any work and so on? It's like the status of this
Does he even
big
get it in
account.
the end? I don't
I don't
know.
think so, no, because I think the conversation about the Fisher account continues. But obviously he uses this whole misrecognition thing to
His
disguise himself
advantage,
as somebody
yeah.
else.
And then also works in his favor again with people mistaking Alan for someone else in
Yeah,
London.
exactly.
And
That's
even
right.
his
Yeah.
lawyer being like, I had dinner
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
Alan in London a couple of
Yeah,
weeks ago. It's
exactly.
just
Yeah.
very, very
Which
funny.
of course then raises this question, you know, did he, didn't he?
Did
You know,
he actually
yeah,
do
yeah.
it? Yeah.
But it's one of those scenes which again in the book we see it through Patrick's eyes with all of the kind of gory detail, but actually the way that it's done in the film is more oblique, I guess, and again has the potential for kind of the comedic aspect, because you know Paul Allen comes around and wonders why there's, you know, newspaper carefully taped all underneath his chair, and why is Patrick wearing the unattractive raincoat, and of course it's one of the many sort of slasher film references. I think the axe killing, just like we see later with the chainsaw as well. It's also is it that murder where he does the dance?
Yes, it is the
Is
one where he's talking about music, and
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Paul Allen turns around and goes, "Are you wearing the raincoat?" And he goes, "Yeah, yeah." He's like, "Is that a raincoat?" He says, "Yeah, it is." And he's just having a little,
Yeah,
a little dance.
because the dance reminded me of, I think it's of a reference, go back to something we talked about before, the Clockwork Orange, and when they're doing the
Yes,
singing in
yes.
the rain dance as well, that kind of mixture of it's the sort of the bathos or the horror combined with the sort
Yeah.
of levity of the dancing. Anyway, we're led to believe that he kills Paul Allen, although whether he does or not is somewhat unclear later on in the story, as it were, because Patrick is told that he has an alibi after he thinks that he doesn't have an alibi because he did it.
Yes.
And I was interested in this, maintaining this idea about did he do it, didn't he do it, because you were talking about Willem Dafoe and the way in which that character is played out.
Yeah.
Do you think that the detective, Defoe's character, does he think that Patrick is guilty? Do you reckon?
It's hard, I mean, again, the way it's played out, I think is meant to have the audience led to believe that he does, and I think I think he doesn't, but obviously with the kind of that I like that, yeah, the irony is I feel like he doesn't, but we're led to believe that he does. It's the way that the lines are played out, how Willem Dafoe's character keeps saying, you let me know if you think of anything, let me know when you find out where you were the night of Paul Allen's disappearance, and it's kind of to play up that big tension about the whole situation for Patrick's character. But at the end of the day, he's just like, oh yeah, people disappear all the time, and again, it kind of that's the overarching kind of ending that despite all of these like horrific things that Patrick has done, he just gets away with it. And there's a complete lack of understanding even on his part how he does just continue to evade responsibility for his actions.
Yeah.
Kind of monologue right at the end. What does he say? Do we actually have it in the notes?
I don't know. But while you think about that, we could think about the way in which Paul Allen's flat gets used, because
yes,
that is one of the sort of turning points, isn't it? It's where
that's
the worst of the horror takes place, but
is where exactly. Well, because one of the things that don't add up is exactly that is Paul Allen's place. If he is still alive, how did Patrick Bateman gain access to his apartment and use it for the things that he did without anyone finding out? And also, why would the detective not? I'm starting to be like,
well, this is the thing. It's where it starts to fall apart in a way, because you're right. Okay, so even if the police don't seem to be involved, presumably because adult man disappearing, whatever, with a suitcase packed, but you're right. The belief that when we see obviously the sort of the biggest slasher horror moment in the film, and also one of the kind of potentially funniest moments, if we can detach ourselves from that fact that it's a man trying to chase down and kill a woman. Maybe we should never consider this funny, but I think that there is a reading of that there. But he kills this woman that he apparently knows in this threesome with Christy, the prostitute who he'd picked up before, and then he chases Christy with a chainsaw, which is obviously the sort of Texas Chainsaw Massacre moment. But it becomes ridiculous. She keeps opening doors and finding more bodies and things like that. We didn't mention the fact that Gene is served the sorbet that he's been keeping in the freezer alongside a woman's head. So there's a lot of this sort of thing.
Jarring as hell. Also the literal bodies in the closet.
Yeah, exactly.
It can be read as funny, and it isn't really, but I feel like that's part of what the satire is.
Well, I think that's exactly. Especially if we start sort of thinking that this is it becomes more and more kind of like surreal in a way, coming up to the point in which he kills Christy in the most unlikely chainsaw moment, where he just drops it from like the top floor of the stairs and it lands on her at the bottom of the flight of stairs. This is highly physics is not going his way, you'd have thought. And also the fact when he's running down the corridor in that very famous scene wearing his white pants and his trainers and holding the chainsaw, it's obviously ridiculous. The other bit that made me think of this as well, where they actually really play it to the camera, is when he kind of like loses control and he's just like running through the buildings and shooting people, and he ends up in a kind of gunfight with the police. And he shoots the police car and it explodes the way that cars only explode in action movies. And even he is like, what the hell? And so the whole thing is moving in this kind of meta narrative where you really don't know whether he's in his own.
I think that's like escalation to the sort of very end kind of sort of chase scene. I think that is kind of the pinnacle where he's kind of lost his mind, and we kind of realize, has this the whole time it been sort of this unreliable narrator kind of context for the whole movie. But that specific scene, and I've also just pulled up the final monologue, but we'll get to that in a little bit. But,
should we just talk about the flat first, and that when he goes back to Philip Allen's apartment? Because what do you make of that scene?
Obviously, he's just kind of confessed to to his lawyer, rings up his lawyer, says like, "Oh, you're my lawyer. I'm going to confess right now. I think I've killed like 30 people or
Oh
something like
yeah,
that."
because he's not
He's like,
sure about the numbers, is he?
he's
He's
not.
like,
He's not even quite sure. But he's like, I've killed quite a fair couple, to
yeah.
be honest. And I'm confessing this to you now. Blah 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 blah. Next day, sleeps in it, goes back to the apartment. Everything is just completely repainted, redone. It looks like a different place, and he's just kind of walking through, and there's people getting shown this apartment and everything, and all of the bodies and the kind of horrific evidence of what he's done has been removed. And he's obviously again kind of a bit like, whoa. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, again, this is kind of where the like whole where I was watching this movie, the story kind of fell apart for me because it's a mystery of like what's happened, where has this gone. He speaks to a woman there who's kind of seems like to be the real estate person.
Yeah, that's right. And she also, there's that
She's
kind
very
of cryptic
secretive.
sort of.
Yeah.
I often wonder whether we're seeing both that and also his conversation with Defoe in the first kind of interview scene, which
Yes.
interestingly I read was filmed 3 times, and each time
Yes,
William
and they
Defoe was
different.
to do a different like perspective on the
Yes.
situation.
Yeah, and I think they all stitch them together, makes it so disjointed, that whole scene, I think, with the interview. Yes.
And
Yeah.
I think we see a lot like with Patrick's kind of paranoia adding a sort of layer of meaning that
Yeah.
maybe isn't there. Like with the real estate woman, if you take the words at sort of face value, she's just got this guy who's turned up to a viewing without an appointment and is acting weirdly. Of course, she's going to ask him to
Like,
leave.
can you go? Yeah.
But we're understanding it as this kind of, oh, but maybe she's some part of some kind of
bigger
cover up
conspiracy.
crew.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think this might be like and obviously afterwards he goes to find his lawyer, and then there's some bar or restaurant, and he speaks to him again, gets confused for someone else. And when he sort of brings up, Patrick called you last night about this, this, and this, and his lawyer goes, "Oh, that was a bloody brilliant joke."
Yeah, exactly.
Bloody funny joke. And I don't know, maybe it's some kind of like a bit of a narrative on how, that like upper elites do get away with a lot of
I think so.
things.
So we can understand the flat as kind of that idea of whitewashing away
yeah,
any kind of
away, yeah.
crime. Yeah.
There's and there is that kind of there's no having to deal with the consequences if you have.
Yeah.
And I guess it's almost like they the fact that Patrick has no part in this cover up himself. It's kind of it feels like someone is protecting him. The people, the top 1% sort of seem to like maybe protect each other. Maybe there's like a kind of thread going through there.
I mean, it's also though, I think something about this, if we understand it as the opposite, which is obviously that Patrick didn't do any of these things and that he is just vividly imagining doing them, then when he cries out for help, he calls his lawyer, he calls Jean, and he's having a breakdown. Nobody is willing to recognize that there might be something wrong there.
With him,
so that again suggests a dystopian kind of collective wherein nobody has any actual kind of care or concern or even really knows any of the people around them, because as we've seen, they confuse them with one another. He's given an alibi at somewhere where he doesn't think he was, at a dinner and so on. So does anyone actually notice who is where? A lot of it suggests this creation of identity means that nobody actually knows anybody else.
There's like a sense of anonymity there anyway. But I mean, how do you interpret it? Do you think all of it is within his head, some of it might be within his head, or in a sort of movie universe kind of way? Did it all happen?
I don't know. I've got really mixed views on this. I think that in a way the effect of the film, and the same effect comes through in the book, but the effect is it rests a lot in that continuing tension.
Yes.
That we and Patrick don't seem to know any of the true facts here. And I think that this also then links into this idea of how we can read this as Patrick as a kind of everyman, not because like all Wall Street yuppies are potential serial killers, but more in this idea that Patrick isn't himself like a unique monster, which I think if we knew he was definitely doing these things or whatever, then we'd be able to categorize him as this kind of somebody who goes beyond, who's kind of like a disruptive force that sort of takes this
Yeah,
world of elitism into something horrific. I think he's actually much more just another one of them. And so
another
maybe he
one. Yeah,
doesn't do these things. Maybe he thinks about them. Maybe they're an outplaying of his misogyny and his
yeah,
elitism and so on. And that makes me think of this, as he's like almost like a postmodern embodiment of this world in which he self-creates. So he is neither Patrick Bateman nor any of the other identities that he is given.
yeah.
He is neither a serial killer nor a
Wall Street banker, I
yeah,
guess.
exactly, or indeed for that matter a kind of hallucinating mentally ill man. I mean, he sort
Yeah,
of fragments into all of those things in the way
yeah,
that kind of postmodernism
yeah,
does. And the genre destabilization, the way that in one sense it's kind of like gory horror, another way it's psychological thriller, and another way it's kind of pornographic literature. The fact that it does all of those things creates this sort of sense of the falseness, the sort of instability of these identities that consumerism is placing upon people like him.
Well, I'll read out the monologue
Yeah,
because I
read
feel like
all
that
about the
quite
monologue. Yeah.
really does sum up quite a lot of what was just said. But he says right at the end, there are no barriers to cross. All I have in common with the uncontrollable and the insane, the vicious and the evil, all the mayhem I have caused and my utter indifference towards it, I have now surpassed. My pain is constant and sharp. I do not hope for a better world for anyone. In fact, I want my pain to be inflicted on others. I want no one to escape. But even after admitting this, there is no catharsis. My punishment continues to elude me, and I gain no deeper knowledge of myself. No new knowledge can be extracted from my telling. This confession has meant nothing. I mean, I think the sort of lack of catharsis that he
Mm.
describes does kind of encapsulate the cycle of kind of like emptiness and violence, and the fact that it doesn't
Yeah.
give him any clearer understanding of himself. It's just, I don't know, just I feel like the whole entire I feel like for him, it all kind of sums up this like bit of existential void that he kind
Mm.
of feels.
And I think I tie
Yeah,
in with that this idea that when we were talking about this idea that there is an equivalent tone between him doing all the stages of his morning ritual and him preparing his home to axe somebody to death or whatever. All of these, the fact that that's tonally the same as one another, even I
yeah,
think within the film, means that what you were just saying about this kind of like existential void is played out both in the plastering on of the kind of latest consumer product or eating at the latest best restaurant or whatever creates
yeah,
emptiness. Confessing to murder and mayhem or indeed the conducting of those things doesn't fill a void either. So almost saying that none of this, all these facets that allegedly make up Patrick Bateman's identity, none of them actually has any real meaning. And if we take this back to being something that actually we should say, have some sympathy for those young men who kind of fit themselves into the Andrew Tate audience and who we talked about in Fight Club and to a less extent in Joker, they may well be experiencing that kind of sense of void and then filling it with something that is really harmful.
yeah.
Yeah, well, okay, that was interesting and broad.
Mm.
So takeaway message, if any,
Oof.
might be a bit
Takeaway
too
message.
complicated for
That
this
might,
film
yeah.
somehow.
Takeaway message. Okay, give me like a little. So what? You start off with your takeaway message, and I'll tack mine onto the end as a little
I
extra.
think I might cheat and just read out one of the quotations that I cited for the notes for today. I'll put this into the show notes, but there's an article by a guy called Martin Rogers
Mhm.
called Video Nasties and the Monstrous Bodies of American Psycho. And I would critique some of the things that he says, but I liked this observation particularly where he says Bateman is not some horrific aberration, but a yuppie everyman. He is, as far as his elite acquaintances are concerned, essentially normal. Early in the novel, Evelyn's comments about Tim Price negate the only claims to actuality Patrick has. When Patrick suggests that Evelyn is attracted to Tim because he is rich, good looking, and has a great body, Evelyn responds with, everybody's rich, everybody's good looking, everybody has a great body now. So Patrick, rich, good-looking, possessed of a good body, is the everyman of his culture. Harron's film exchanges this normalcy for an exaggerated desirability, introducing Patrick to the audience while he narrates his morning bathing ritual. The cameras linger over Patrick's nude body, showing him stretching and working out, showering, and sets him as a lavish display of eroticized masculinity. He's therefore made not only desirable, but accessible, perfected. Even when the film eventually unleashes Patrick in his most gruesome form, the scene where he chases and murders Christine with a chainsaw, he appears buffed and, to an extent, comical. So that picks up, I think, on something of what you were saying about this idea about almost being trapped into the idea of thinking of Patrick Bateman as something that you would like to wear a Halloween costume of, something aspirational, and something that, you know, this darkness underneath this very kind of superficial desirability. So yeah, okay.
Takeaway message right there. I don't know if I could top that, to be honest.
No, that's very much better just to steal from
yeah, you've kind
Rogers.
of stumped me a little bit.
Yeah, no.
I mean, I feel like it's a hard movie to sort of sum up in.
It is, absolutely. I think because of these tensions.
Yeah. And there's quite a lot to go off of on there. But yeah, to be honest, I haven't spoken about it. Claire was asking me what I thought of the movie before starting recording. And I did actually enjoy it. I'm not gonna lie. I thought it was very well made. And I might even give it another rewatch, having kind of like dived into the different aspects of it. Because
I certainly, I mean, I'd seen it before years ago, but then I'd seen it quite recently when we were thinking about maybe doing it for this, and then obviously I watched it again, and it has depth to it in the same way that I would say that, you know, the book I think has depth to it as well, even though it's sort of initially
maybe
dismissed.
Not another book reread, to be fair.
No, I'm done on that, thanks. But I can see the reason why there is a sort of credible reason to commit to reading it.
Indeed.
Good. So next episode is going to be on the Idiocracy. This is your suggestion.
I think, well, it was suggested to me by my boss over the summer.
Yes. I gave you your watch list of.
If anyone's in London, go to Beef Steaks on Morphy Market. It's very good. Very good steak sandwiches, if that's just that sort of thing. But yes, this was suggested to me, the Idiocracy. I think it's hopefully going to be more about a light-hearted one. As we've had some pretty heavy episodes.
We have had a little bit, haven't we? Yeah.
Yes.
So that will be out in a couple of weeks. All being well, Marsha and I are both fighting off illness left, right, and centre.
Yes,
but there will be a newsletter before then, if we manage it. And you can keep up with all of that by following us on Instagram at Dystopian Fiction Current Affairs, on Substack, also at Dystopian Fiction Current Affairs, and you can contact us via email or by putting a question on Spotify or by messaging us on Insta, any of those things. We would love to hear from you.
Indeed.
So thank you very much for listening, and thank you, Marsha,
for
all of that.